Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another Jane Austen July video. And today we're going to be talking about the character of Miss Bates from Jane Austen's novel Emma. This video is going to be full of spoilers for Jane Austen's novel Emma, so if you haven't read Emma, please do not watch this video. And I would say that especially for Emma. You know, some people are really worried about spoilers and some people are less worried about spoilers, but I feel like Emma is the Jane Austen novel I would most recommend going into without having been spoiled for some of the plot points, because I do think it's one of the Jane Austen novels that is affected the most by knowing the plot before going into it, if that makes sense. Anyway, hopefully if you're sticking around for this video, you have read Jane Austen's amazing novel Emma and you have encountered the wonderful character that is Miss Bates. Now, I love Miss Bates and I'm really excited to make a video talking all about her. I really enjoy doing these videos every Jane Austen July where I take a particular Jane Austen character and dissect them. I've done a few before, so I have done Mr. Collins, Caroline Bingley and Mrs. Bennet from Pride and Prejudice. I've done Mr. Willoughby and Mrs. Jennings from Sense and Sensibility, and this year it is the turn of Emma and we're going to be discussing Miss Bates. I'm going to do another video in the next week, I hope, that is also about Emma, but one that is not looking at a specific character but a specific subplot, but I think that'll probably be in a similar kind of form. Anyway, today we're here to talk about Miss Bates, who is a wonderful character. I really like Miss Bates for a lot of reasons, and I think she's a really interesting character because she's one of those characters who at first glance appears to be an entirely comic character. She talks a lot, and there are many moments within Emma where she has pages upon pages of dialogue in which she jumps around from one point to the next. She's often quite comic, and Emma and various other characters in the book kind of dismiss her as being quite silly. At first glance, she is one of those sort of silly characters, the woman who talks too much and kind of isn't taken seriously either by the heroine or the world around her. But I actually think she has a much more important role to play in Emma than merely a comic one, and I think Jane Austen does a lot of interesting things with Miss Bates and kind of social criticism. Every time I reread Emma, I notice Miss Bates more and more, and I find new interesting things to think about relating to her, so I thought it would be fun to have a chat today about Miss Bates, because although Miss Bates on the surface may seem like a silly comic character, I would argue that we should probably all be taking Miss Bates more seriously than we do. And also I think there is a reason why Jane Austen gives Miss Bates so many long speeches in the novel. As I said, there are several bits in Emma where, certainly in the edition of Emma I have, there's just 4 pages that is just Miss Bates dialogue, which I love. And you know, Jane Austen makes us listen to Miss Bates, and so we should. I'm going to talk about kind of her role in the book, I suppose. And one role that she obviously has in the novel is a comic role. As I said, Miss Bates is funny. There's no denying that she is funny. Of course she is. She talks a lot and she sometimes says silly things, and there are some wonderful comic moments in Emma around Miss Bates. I find her always very funny. I find her dialogue such a delight to read, and she definitely is in the novel to be a comic character and to give you that wonderful comedy that Jane Austen does so well. But I think she has a lot of other roles in the book as well, and one role I think she has that I find really interesting is to kind of be a foil for Emma. Emma is one of those novels where Emma is, you know, an interesting, significant central character, but there are a lot of other characters in the book that you can see set up in contrast to her and that are there to tell us things about Emma as well as there to tell us things about themselves. You know, there are a lot of characters in Emma that are foils for Emma: Frank Churchill, Jane Fairfax, Mrs. Elton, many more. But I think Miss Bates is an interesting foil to Emma because they have very different temperaments and very different life circumstances, and those things are contrasted interestingly. So here is the introduction we get to Emma, the very first line of the book. Emma Woodhouse, handsome, clever and rich, with a comfortable home and happy disposition, seemed to unite some of the best blessings of existence, and had lived nearly 21 years in the world with very little to distress or vex her. Very interesting opening to Emma. I always think Emma Woodhouse is handsome, clever and rich and seemed to unite some of the best blessings of existence. Jane Austen does not say that she does unite some of the best blessings of existence, she just says that she seems to. And then later on in Emma, here is our introduction to Miss Bates. Miss Bates enjoyed a most uncommon degree of popularity for a woman neither young, handsome, rich, nor married. So it's very interesting that Jane Austen chooses to repeat the kind of handsome and rich words here to kind of immediately draw the comparison between Miss Bates and Emma. Miss Bates stood in the very worst predicament in the world for having much of the public favour, and she had no intellectual superiority to make atonement to herself or frighten those who might hate her into outward respect. She had never boasted either beauty or cleverness. Her youth had passed without distinction, and her middle of life was devoted to the care of a failing mother and the endeavour to make a small income go as far as possible. And yet she was a happy woman, and a woman whom no one named without goodwill. It was her own universal goodwill and contented temper which worked such wonders. She loved everybody and was interested in everybody's happiness, quick-sighted into everybody's merits, thought herself a most fortunate creature and surrounded with blessings in such an excellent mother and so many good neighbours and friends, and a home that wanted for nothing. The simplicity and cheerfulness of her nature, her contented and grateful spirit, were a recommendation to everybody and a mine of felicity to herself. And later on in the novel, Mr. Weston says something that I really like. He says, Miss Bates is a standing lesson of how to be happy. And I think there's a really interesting contrast between Emma and Miss Bates here, is that Emma has everything to make her happy. She's rich, clever, young, handsome, and she seems to unite some of the best blessings of existence. She has all these blessings, but she doesn't really appreciate them. She's kind of not good enough to be entirely happy. Whereas Miss Bates has very little to make her happy. She doesn't have much income. She's not as clever or as handsome as Emma, but she's happy because she's good and because she's kind and because she loves people, and because she, takes pleasure in other people's company in a way that Emma doesn't always. Emma's quite judgmental about other people very often. And so it's Miss Bates's kind of own goodness that makes her a happy person, a happier person than Emma. And she's also popular because of her goodness, which we see throughout. Emma, I would argue, is popular because of her social position and her wit, her cleverness and her good looks, but she's not popular because of her goodness in the way Miss Bates is. So I think it's quite interesting to look at the very different circumstances of Emma and Miss Bates, and to see how happy Miss Bates is with so many less reasons, less superficial reasons at least, to be happy than Emma. She's happy in herself, and that is really nice, and also sets her up as an interesting contrast to Emma, who kind of has her journey of self-discovery to go on over the course of the novel. I think I'm going to come across as being quite harsh to Emma. I do like Emma as a character. I think she's really, really well drawn, and I think her character arc is really interesting, and I find her a really fun character to read about, but I also find her quite frustrating because I think she is very judgmental, and her judgments are usually wrong, and I think that is the point. A lot of Emma is about Emma realizing that her judgment is often wrong, but I also therefore sometimes find her a frustrating character, and I feel like I especially find the way she treats Miss Bates frustrating. Anyway, I think it's really interesting to focus on how happy Miss Bates is and how contented in her life she is, because I think on the surface, at first glance, she seems like an example of a silly older single woman, which you do often find in 19th century literature, in a society and literary landscape that was so concerned with the marriage plot and women getting married. An older single woman is often presented as an object of ridicule. That is something you find in lots of 19th century books. And I feel like at first glance, Miss Bates may seem like that character type, but actually she's also an example of a supremely happy, content, older single woman who doesn't seem to at all mind or regret that she isn't married, and seems to have a nice life chatting to her neighbours, and taking delight in talking to people, and good for her. And I suppose I like to focus on that side of Miss Bates. Obviously, I was just talking about Emma's character development over the course of the novel, and another kind of key role that Miss Bates has in the novel is to provide a lesson for Emma, especially in the Box Hill scene, which is, a very, very big, important moment in Emma, where Emma insults Miss Bates on this day trip they're all on, and Mr. Knightley upbraids her afterwards, which is an important moment, both in sort of Emma and Knightley's love story, but also in terms of Emma's character arc and her realising that she was wrong, and realising that her judgment and her behaviour isn't always right. I'll read a little bit of the scene. Everyone is kind of a bit quiet and awkward, and Frank Churchill is talking to Emma and says to the group, "Here are 7 of you besides myself," who Emma is pleased to say is very entertaining already, "and she only demands from each of you either one thing very clever, be it prose or verse, original or repeated, or 2 things moderately clever, or 3 things very dull indeed," and she engages to laugh heartily at them all. "Oh, very well," exclaimed Miss Bates, "then I need not be uneasy. 3 things very dull indeed. That will just do for me, you know. I should be sure to say 3 dull things as soon as I ever open my mouth, shan't I?" Looking around with the most good-humoured dependence on everybody's assent. "Do you not all think I shall?" Emma could not resist. "Ah, ma'am, but there may be a difficulty, pardon me, but you'll be limited as to number, only 3 at once." Miss Bates, deceived by the mock ceremony of her manner, did not immediately catch her meaning, but when it burst on her, it could not anger, though a slight blush showed that it could pain her. "Ah, well, to be sure, yes, I see what she means," turning to Mr. Knightley, "and I will try to hold my tongue. I must make myself very disagreeable, or she would not have said such a thing to an old friend." This is Emma at her worst. And indeed, I feel like Emma's interactions with Miss Bates often show her at her worst. Like, I feel like her judgment of Miss Bates shows the harsher side of Emma, and the side that doesn't have any respect for or patience with people who do not have the benefits that she has. And part of Emma's character development in the course of the novel is about her getting past this and learning to see that this is wrong. You know, later on in that scene, Mr. Knightley upbraids her for her behaviour and tells her it was badly done, as it was. Never had she felt so agitated, mortified, grieved at any circumstance in her life. She was most forcibly struck. The truth of this representation there was no denying. She felt it at her heart. How could she have been so brutal, so cruel to Miss Bates? Emma as a character is spoilt and judgmental, and part of the point of the novel is Emma learning to realise that her judgment is often wrong and that she, with all her privileges, shouldn't look down on others in the way that she does. Miss Bates and Jane Fairfax are key examples of this, and Mr. Martin kind of is too, I would say. And I think this moment in Box Hill where Emma realises she has been cruel, I think is really important. And I think Emma can learn not only not to be cruel from what she says to Miss Bates and how it clearly affects her, but I think she can also perhaps learn to be kind from the kindness of someone like Miss Bates, and perhaps also learn to be happier. As Mr. Weston says, Miss Bates is a standing lesson of how to be happy, and I think Emma kind of needs that lesson too. Like, in general, Emma is a fairly like restless character who always wants to like interfere with people's lives and matchmake and, you know, try to arrange other people's affairs, whereas I feel like actually both Emma and Miss Bates are quite sort of gossipy in that sense, and have an interest in other people's lives, but I feel like Miss Bates just has like an interest in learning about things rather than in like trying to interfere, so I think that's quite interesting too. Another role that Miss Bates has in the book that I find pretty interesting is a role in kind of like description and information. Miss Bates kind of often sets the scene and gives us like key information in her dialogue. I was thinking, for example, of the ball scene at the Crown Inn, where we have this really long speech, like a couple of pages from Miss Bates, which begins, "So very obliging of you, no rain at all, nothing to signify, I do not care for myself, quite thick shoes," and Jane declares, well, as soon as she was within the door, "Well, this is brilliant indeed, this is admirable, excellently contrived, upon my word, nothing wanting, could not have imagined it, so well lighted up. Jane, Jane, look, did you ever see anything? Oh, Mr. Weston, you really must have Aladdin's lamp. Good Mrs. Stokes would not know her own room again. I saw her as soon as I came in. She was standing in the entrance. Oh, Mrs. Stokes, said I, but I had not time for more." In this like section of Miss Bates's dialogue, we get a really good like impression of the ballroom and kind of the impressiveness of it. And so Jane Austen kind of like uses her dialogue to set the scene. And we also get later on in that same passage, Miss Bates starts like greeting all of the neighbours as they come in. So you also get a sense of how like full the room is. And I think Jane Austen like uses Miss Bates's dialogue in really effective ways to like set the scene. I also think there are a few moments where we get like important narrative clues buried within Miss Bates's dialogue, especially around Jane Fairfax and Frank Churchill and their secret engagement. But because Miss Bates talks so much and her dialogue often has lots of like little details in, it's easy to kind of miss what details are important plot points. So for example, when Emma learns that Jane Fairfax has taken a governess position. This is what Miss Bates says. I was so astonished when she first told me what she had been saying to Mrs. Elton, and when Mrs. Elton at the same moment came congratulating me upon it. It was before tea. Stay. No, it could not be before tea, because we were just going to cards, and yet it was before tea, because I remember thinking, oh, no, now I recollect, now I have it. Something happened before tea, but not that. Mr. Elton was called out of the room before tea. Old John Adby's son wanted to speak with him. Poor old John, I have a great regard for him. He was clerk to my poor father 27 years, and now, poor old man, he is bedridden and very poorly with the rheumatic gout in his joints. I must go and see him today, and so will Jane, I'm sure, if she gets out at all. And poor John's son came to talk to Mr. Elton about relief from the parish. He is very well to do himself, you know, being head man at the Crown, ostler, and everything of that sort, but still he cannot keep his father without some help. And so when Mr. Elton came back, he told us what John Ostler had been telling him, and then it came out about the Chase having been sent to Randalls to take Mr. Frank Churchill to Richmond. That was what happened before tea. It was after tea that Jane spoke to Mrs. Elton. And this speech feels like Miss Bates, you know, just like landing all this information on Emma because she loves to talk. But actually, there's a really important clue here, because what we learn from this speech and what you notice on a reread is that Jane has accepted the position of governess only after she has learned that Frank has left Highbury. Before tea, Jane learns that Frank has left Highbury without making things up with her, and after tea, despairing of their relationship, she takes on this position as governess because she thinks that everything is over between her and Frank. That's the moment she makes a decision. But because Miss Bates's dialogue is so like fluid and natural and jumps around, as people often do when they talk, therefore you don't realise that this is a clue. And I think it's so fun that Jane Austen does that. Like, it's really fun sort of burying narrative clues within Miss Bates's like massive dialogue. I think that's really fun. Also, just a side note, I love the way Miss Bates's dialogue is written because it is so natural. It's so just real speech. Obviously, Jane Austen is an author who like sometimes plays with caricature and exaggerates characters. But actually, I feel like the way she writes Miss Bates's dialogue is just completely natural and just feels completely believable. And it's such a skill to be able to write that kind of very natural dialogue that is actually the way people talk. So yeah, I love that too. Another important role Miss Bates has in Emma is, I would say, one of social critique. I think Jane Austen is using Miss Bates to take an interesting look at how people in Miss Bates's social position are viewed. So let's take a look at Miss Bates's sort of class and social position. This is what we know about Miss Bates and her mother. Mrs. Bates, the widow of a former vicar of Highbury, was a very old lady, almost past everything but tea and quadrille. She lived with her single daughter in a very small way and was considered with all the regard and respect which a harmless old lady under such untoward circumstances can excite. So Miss Bates and her mother, Mrs. Bates, are impoverished gentlewomen, basically. Miss Bates's father was a clergyman, but he has now passed away, and she lives with her mother without much income, without much money. Mr. Knightley says to Emma later, "She is poor. She has sunk from the comfort she was born to, and if she lived to old age, must probably sink more. Her situation should secure your compassion." As the daughter of a clergyman, Miss Bates is she's a gentlewoman, she's genteel, she's of genteel birth, but she doesn't have much money. We know that Miss Bates and Mrs. Bates have one servant, Patty, who is mentioned sometimes, but they don't have a carriage and they basically live in a flat. So this is what we're told about their house. The house belonged to people in business. Mrs. and Miss Bates occupied the drawing room floor, and there, in the very moderate-sized apartment, which was everything to them, visitors were most cordially and even gratefully welcomed. So they live in a flat above a shop, possibly, when it says the house belonged to people in business, or it might just be that they have like one floor and another family live on the bottom floor. The drawing room floor basically means the first floor, I think. So they live, upstairs and presumably have a couple of rooms, and they're able to afford to keep one servant, so they obviously like have some money, but their income would be quite limited, and they would certainly have like a much lower income than other people of their social class. In a video I made recently comparing Jane Austen and Elizabeth Gaskell, I spoke about Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell being a novel full of Miss Bateses. And Cranford is a novel full of Miss Bateses. It's full of impoverished gentlewomen who are trying to pretend that they have much more money than they have because they have to keep up their sort of respectability and the trappings of their social class, even though they don't really have the money for it. And that is, you know, the social position that Miss Bates is in as well. I've been trying to work out how old Miss Bates is. We're not told in the novel, but we do know that Jane Fairfax is the daughter of Miss Bates's younger sister, who is now dead, and that Jane Fairfax is around 21. She's always described as being the same age as Emma. So presuming there wasn't a huge difference between our Miss Bates, Hetty Bates, presumably short for Henrietta, and her younger sister Jane. Miss Bates is probably in her 40s. She could be in her early 50s, but I think she's more likely to be in her 40s. She described at one point as being in her middle of life, which in the 19th century would probably mean 40s, I would say. And there's also a moment where Mr. Knightley says to Emma, "You, whom she had known from an infant, whom she had seen grow up from a period where her notice was an honour." And that to me implies that when Emma was an infant, like when Emma was a very little child, Miss Bates was like a young lady of probably a similar age to Emma is now. You know, when her notice would have been an honour, that would have been when she was like the young lady daughter of the local clergyman. So now that Emma's 20, I think Miss Bates is probably in her 40s. The reason why I'm focusing on Miss Bates's age here is because of all the characters in Jane Austen's work, Miss Bates is the character whose circumstances most resemble Jane Austen's circumstances, and I think that's really fascinating. So when Emma was published in December 1815, Jane Austen had just turned 40. She, like Miss Bates, was an impoverished gentlewoman, the daughter of a clergyman who had grown up in relative security and who had seen her like social importance and income diminish over the course of her life, especially following her father's death. Jane Austen also had a lot of nieces and nephews and really valued those relationships, we know from her letters. And of course there are other niece-aunt relationships in Jane Austen, you know, like Elizabeth Bennet and Mrs. Gardiner. But I do think it's interesting that Jane Austen's like older, unmarried woman in her 40s character is also a doting aunt. I just find it really interesting that Miss Bates is the character whose circumstances are Jane Austen's circumstances. And I do wonder if Miss Bates is partly in the novel to kind of explore stereotypes and social stigma about women of that age who are unmarried, because I do think, especially kind of in the 19th century, when there was such an emphasis placed on women getting married, and of that being like the purpose of a woman's life, I do think, well, you can see in 19th century literature that there is stereotyping of sort of women who get to a certain age without being married, and I feel like through Miss Bates, Jane Austen looks really interestingly at the lack of respect given to single women of that age, of her social position. And I think that is a very interesting part of Emma, considering that was Jane Austen's own kind of age and social position. You know, I think Jane Austen uses Miss Bates in Emma to look at the complicated social position of people like Miss Bates and Jane Austen in a really interesting way. I also think it's interesting that Jane is a family name within the Bates family. So Miss Bates is called Hetty or Henrietta probably. I don't think she's called Henrietta ever in the book. I think she's only called Hetty, but presumably that's short for Henrietta. And her younger sister was called Jane, and then her niece Jane Fairfax is obviously called Jane. And you know, I think I've said before that I always find it really funny that Jane Bennet in Pride and Prejudice is called Jane, and she is the person who thinks really highly of everyone and thinks everyone is nice and never sees the bad in people, which if you read Jane Austen's letters was not Jane Austen. And I always imagine that it was a fun in-joke that Jane Austen named Jane Bennet Jane. But I also kind of wonder if Jane Fairfax and Jane Bates, deceased, are called Jane to kind of put Jane as a family name into that family where there is a character circumstance very similar to Jane Austen herself. I don't know. Okay, I want to talk a bit about Miss Bates' silliness. I suppose I want to ask the question, like, is she silly and does it matter? Because she's often described as being silly. This is how Miss Bates is described by Emma and Harriet when Emma and Harriet are having a discussion about her. But then to be an old maid at last, like Miss Bates, says Harriet. That is as formidable an image as you could present, Harriet, and if I thought I should ever be like Miss Bates, so silly, so satisfied, so smiling, so prosing, so undistinguishing and unfastidious, and so apt to tell everything relative to everybody around me, I would marry tomorrow. But between us, I am convinced there never can be any likeness except in being unmarried. She is only too good-natured and too silly to suit me, but in general she is very much to the taste of everybody, though single and though poor. Poverty certainly has not contracted her mind. I really believe if she had only a shilling in the world, she would be very likely to give away sixpence of it, and nobody is afraid of her. That is a great charm. I find it really interesting that Emma kind of dismisses Miss Bates's silliness, but then also does like admit that she is good-natured and generous. But you know, although Miss Bates is often described as silly, and although she goes on very long speeches which do sometimes feel a bit tangential, I feel like she is actually much cleverer than she appears on first glance. When I was listening to Emma on audiobook this time, I noticed a speech that I had never much paid attention to before. It's when Miss Bates is discussing Mr. Elton's forthcoming marriage with Emma and Jane Fairfax, and this is what Miss Bates says. Yes, he has been gone just 4 weeks, as you observe, Miss Woodhouse. 4 weeks yesterday, and Miss Hawkins, well, I always rather fancied it would be some young lady hereabouts, not that it ever... Miss Cole once whispered to me, but I immediately said, no, Mr. Elton is a most worthy young man, but... In short, I do not think I am particularly quick at those sort of discoveries. I do not pretend to it. What is before me, I see. At the same time, nobody could wonder if Mr. Elton should have aspired. Miss Woodhouse lets me chatter on so good-humouredly. She knows I would not offend for the world. How does Miss Smith do? She seems quite recovered now. Have you heard from Mrs. John Knightley lately? What I take from this speech is that Miss Bates entirely understands the situation. Through gossip and through her own observations, she knows that Mr. Elton aspired to Emma and that Emma wasn't keen. And I also think the fact that Miss Bates moves immediately from this implication about Mr. Elton and Emma to asking after Harriet. I think Miss Bates also realises that Harriet had an interest in Mr. Elton. I don't think that's random. I think this is an incredibly knowing speech. But you don't notice it because Miss Bates cuts herself short and often moves from one subject to the next, speaking almost at random it seems, but it's not random, is it? The very thought of Elton and Emma leads her to Harriet because I think she's worked it out. And I kind of love that, especially because Emma, you know, thinks she's so clever, but it never occurs to her that Mr. Elton is after her, not after Harriet. But Miss Bates has worked it out. Miss Bates, who Emma rates so little, who Emma thinks is silly and not intelligent, Miss Bates knows, because Miss Bates actually has a lot more emotional intelligence than Emma gives her credit for. And yeah, I like that. Also, Miss Bates is very self-aware, which I think is quite interesting. There's a scene later where they're talking about Mrs. Perry and the carriage, long story, but anyway, Miss Bates says, I will not positively answer for my never having dropped a hint, because I know I do sometimes pop out a thing before I am aware. I am a talker, you know. I am rather a talker, and now and then I have let a thing escape me which I should not. I am not like Jane. I wish I were. I will answer for it. She has never betrayed the least thing in the world. And I like the speech and how self-aware it shows that Miss Bates is, which I think detracts from the idea of her being silly, because yes, she talks a lot, but she's perfectly aware of that. The fact that she is aware that she sometimes says things without thinking is quite a thing to be aware of. Like, I don't know, I just really like that moment. And there are other moments where we see her emotional intelligence too, especially around Jane Fairfax. You know, there's this moment when Emma and Frank upset Jane by playing the word Dixon in a word game, and this is what happens. Jane was evidently displeased, looked up, and seeing herself watched, blushed more deeply than he had ever perceived her, and saying only, I did not know that proper names were allowed, pushed away the letters with even an angry spirit, and looked resolved to be engaged by no other word that could be offered. Her face was averted from those who made the attack, and turned towards her aunt. Aye, very true, my dear, cried the latter, though Jane had not spoken a word. I was just going to say the same thing. It is time for us to be going, indeed. The evening is closing in, and Grandmamma will be looking for us. My dear sir, you are too obliging. We really must wish you good night. In other words, Miss Bates sees that her niece is upset by something and immediately, gets her to safety and away from an upsetting situation. She's not oblivious at all. Miss Bates may talk a lot, but she is far from being unintelligent. She's very perceptive. Certainly about other people's emotions, and certainly about her nieces. So though Miss Bates does have her comic moments, I think there is a lot more depth to her than simply being silly. And I also think that she is so kind that whether or not she's silly kind of doesn't matter. Like, if you compare Emma and Miss Bates, Emma is clever, well, So is Emma that clever? Because she does often misjudge things. But anyway, Emma, we're told, is clever, but she's often unkind. But Miss Bates is always kind. She is so good-natured a person, and she is happier for it. And I like her more for it. You know, I like Miss Bates more as a person than Emma. And I think there are some sort of key moments where we see her kindness in a way that is really lovely and that show her to be such like a valuable person and a person that you should really look up to. I think a lot about Miss Bates's reaction to Emma's behaviour on Box Hill. I obviously read a bit from Box Hill earlier, and this is what happens in the scene after Box Hill when Emma calls to see Miss Bates. She had a moment's fear of Miss Bates keeping away from her, but Miss Bates came soon, very happy and obliged. But Emma's conscience told her that there was not the same cheerful volubility as before, less ease of look and manner. A very friendly inquiry after Miss Fairfax, she hoped, might lead the way to a return of old feelings. The touch seemed immediate. "Ah, Miss Woodhouse, how kind you are. I suppose you have heard, and are come to give us joy." And then she tells Emma about Jane's new governess position. And then Emma replies, "It must be a severe trial to them all. She had understood it was to be delayed till Colonel Campbell's return." "So very kind," replied Miss Bates. "But you are always kind." There was no bearing such an always. And to break through her dreadful gratitude, Emma made the direct inquiry of, "Where, may I ask, is Miss Fairfax going?" I always think that moment, that you are always kind, is such a completely like forgiving moment, and the generosity of that moment will like always stay with me as one of the like most heroic moments in all of Jane Austen, because Emma was so rude to her, and I really feel like Miss Bates would have every right to be so angry with her. What happens in this scene is Miss Bates sees that Emma feels bad, knows that she has come to see her like with that feeling. And although she is hurt, like we know she's hurt, we see that from the beginning of the scene, she finds a polite way to show Emma that she doesn't resent it, and then they move on. And that's why I love Miss Bates. She has such generosity and kindness of spirits, and I think Emma could learn a lot from her, and does learn a bit from her, but maybe not as much as she needs to. But anyway, this video is about how much I love Miss Bates, not about how much I find Emma frustrating. Okay, so in conclusion, I love Miss Bates. She's great. She's one of my favourite characters in Jane Austen, and although she is very funny, I think it is wrong to view her as a solely comic character, because there's so much else going on with Miss Bates, both in terms of the social criticism about how women in her position are viewed, but also in terms of Emma's character arc and the kind of good qualities Miss Bates has that Emma doesn't have and that Emma needs to learn from. In general, you know, don't underestimate Miss Bates. She's a hugely important part of the novel, and she has so much more to her than the silliness. She is observant, and she's kind, and she's happy, and good for her. So yes, I love Miss Bates. I feel like some of the Let's Talk About videos I've done before, I've, you know, had a lot of complicated things to say about all the various different ways you can interpret characters. But I feel like with the one I made last year about Mrs. Jennings and this year's one about Miss Bates, I just have a very firm reading of those characters. And I think actually there are quite a lot of similarities between Mrs. Jennings and Miss Bates. I think they are both characters who, on first glance, may seem silly, but actually have a lot of like depth and kindness and warmth and a lot of interesting things to tell us and a lot of interesting things to teach the heroines. And I also think it's quite fun to look at how Jane Austen's heroines sometimes learn things from the older women within the stories. So yeah, I love Miss Bates a lot. Okay, that's enough for this video. I hope this has been interesting. Do let me know down in the comments what you think of Miss Bates. My Jane Austen July like video posting filming schedule has like slightly been thrown off course. I have quite a lot of videos I still want to put up before the end of July, so maybe they'll just be like a spree of videos in the last week of July, or maybe I will carry on with some Jane Austen July videos in August. I don't know, but anyway, we will see. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.